I think as we approach this problem of drug addiction and drug abuse, one is certainly encouraged by the multi-purpose or the multi-procedural approach to the study of the problem. I make no claims of being an expert in taking care of narcotic addicts or addicts for anything. I've bumped into a few along the line. I've had no specialized training in this area, but I've had enough to know that this is one of the most tremendous clinical problems that can face a physician. As I reviewed the program for this wonderful multidisciplinary seminar on this drug abuse problem, you've already, I think, been given the idea of the portrait of a drug addict. You've been given some idea of the general national problem of drug abuse. You will hear more about the psychodynamics of drug use from Dr. Baero, I think probably tomorrow. The social and cultural meaning of drug use will come up. And then on the second week, Judge Cox, Dr. Otis Bowen, who is, you may surely know, is a legislator, a general practitioner, a man of great keen thinking, will talk on medical-legal conflicts. And I point these things out to you because they are all of tremendous significance, because they mold the social and the cultural attitude toward the drug addict. In my presentation today, which I propose to keep very informal, I will touch on these things only in as much as I feel it is necessary to make my point for today's discussion. I shall draw more heavily on the actual pharmacological effects of the drug, how they are related to the treatment program. I'll have to mention some of the psychological factors, because these two and the cultural factors are quite pertinent to the problems of treating the addict. Now, for the purposes of simplification, one simply can't in a brief period of time talk about all of the drugs. I shall talk, and I shall limit myself to a discussion of the opiates, and in particular morphine, as the class group of drugs. This is the standard of reference in this series of drugs. It's the one that every other new one is compared with, both for its good and for its bad effects, and for that purpose I shall talk mostly about morphine. And I probably shall not go into much of the actual chemical structure and whatnot of it. Dr. Kaufman, I understand, will be here later this morning from Butler University's Dean of the School of Pharmacy, and undoubtedly will go into that. But let me say this. This is a drug that has been with us as long as mankind has known that there were plants on the earth. Recorded history tells us that 4,000 years ago, this plant, Papaverum somniferum, or the poppy, was cultivated in Europe. The Sumerians in the 4th century BC referred to the psychological effects of opium in their ideographs, and indeed they referred to the poppy as joy plants. The first undisputed reference to poppy juice was found in the writings of Theophrastus in the 3rd century BC. It was a drug that was known to ancient Babylonia, to Greece, to Rome, and to Egypt. Homer very well knew its effects when he referred to the lethal slumber of morphine, or opium, rather. As we follow just briefly the historical evolution, I think there are some things that should be said about the more recent historical events of significance so that we can understand the present time. It was isolated as an alkaloid from opium. And morphine was named in 1803 by a young German pharmacist named Turner, and he named it morphine after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. In the next 15 to 20 years, the alkaloids of codeine, piperine, were isolated and identified, and by the middle of the 19th century, the pure alkaloids were available all over the world rather than the opium itself. In 1853, Woods of Edinburgh, Scotland, invented the hypodermic needle. And it's rather fascinating how we can rationalize on things without observing things, because it was felt that because this was not taken internally, now the morphine was injected parenterally or into the muscle or under the skin, that this would not be addicting because it bypassed the stomach. Well, now we have the isolation and development of a brand new, more potent type of narcotic agent, which is now being injected in large quantities to large number of the injured Civil War veterans. And a new type of addiction arose from this, subsequent to the development and the origination of the hypodermic syringe. Some other factors that toward the end of the last century laid the groundwork in this country for the narcotics problem were, of course, the great influx of the opium smoking, drinking, and eating people from the Orient, where culturally at that time this was quite the accepted thing. And in general, the complete, unrestricted availability of opium. And of course it wasn't until the Harrison Narcotic Act was passed in 1914 that there were any type of legal controls placed upon the growth, sale, development, and so forth of the narcotics. Then more recently, in 1903, around in there, heroin was isolated, and this has been the drug of choice for the addict since 1915. Why this is so, in spite of the fact that heroin is not made in this country, probably because it's about 3 times as strong as morphine, and it takes less bulk. I don't know how many of you read the article in yesterday morning's paper. I meant to bring it up with me. I asked my secretary to cut it out of the paper. Of a new trick now that they have for bringing the drugs in. A couple months ago they had a false gasoline tank on a car, and they traced this car, and they noticed it was only getting about 5 miles a gallon. It was using up an awful lot of gas. And they had a false tank, and it was loaded with heroin underneath, and they imported the car, and I guess the narcotics people got on the track of it and picked it up. Yesterday morning's paper describes the case where they very cleverly plant the drug someplace on a plane. Now, they don't try to retrieve it immediately. They let it go to its destination, and then when it comes back, they look for that plane and then try to retrieve it. And they did find a cache of heroin, which I guess was, if I recall the figures correctly, on actual value was $60,000, and by the time it's cut and put out on the user market, it's probably worth $6 million. if I recall those figures. So this is the illicit drug trade. There's an awful lot of clever people working in this area, and one wonders what a better world it would be if these people would stop trying to beat the odds and use their cleverness for something more worthwhile. As I said, heroin is not made. It is not the drug of choice. It is not used clinically. It's an illegal drug, but nevertheless it is the drug that is used by the addict. Now, generally what we are talking about is a chemical formula and this is getting kind of crude. So's the drug. Now this is the basic formula for morphine. And the reason why I give you this is simply because of the fact that if you do a little chemical manipulating with this, for instance, if you put a methyl group up here, just by one little chemical radical, you're changing this drug tremendously now to a drug which is far less addictive, it's far less likely to develop physical dependence, has somewhat lessened pharmacological functions, has a more explicit suppressive action on the cough centers in the brain stem, and this then is the codeine. If we put an acetyl group on each of these areas and place this with an acetyl group, both above and below, then we are talking about heroin. So these are things which are not quite simply done. Actually, it wasn't until 1925 that the chemical structure for morphine was identified, and it's made, as I understand it, with some difficulty in the laboratory, so it's not easily synthesized. Over the years, there has been a long, determined effort to try to develop drugs which do not have the undesirable effects of morphine and opium. But this has not been too successful either. And I might say one other thing that was quite influential in the development of the drug habit before the turn of the century, and this is related, and I do want to stress this, to the free availability. Opium was available in all kinds of tinctures, tincture of laudanum, and patent nostrums, which were sold without prescription at the drugstore and the corner store and so forth. And actually there were many more addicts at the turn of the century than there are now, at least that are reported right now, because of this very same free availability. So much for the chemistry of it. I do want to mention briefly the specific drug effects as a background to the problem of addiction, and we'll define addiction at that point. But I think as we begin to talk about the specific drug effects of the morphine as the prototype drug, one can begin to see how the addiction comes about, because the addiction is not only psychological, but it is physical as well. First of all, morphine is in that group of drugs which must be considered as narcotics. This narcotic action is manifested by production of analgesia, or a change in sensitiveness to pain, drowsiness, and the catcher is a change in mood. Generally, it will produce euphoria or a state of well-being. Not always. And we'll get back to this a little later. In addition to the changes in mood, there is mental clouding and central nervous system depression. The clouding of the thought processes is, of course, a function of the highest level of the integrated central nervous system function. The depressant action works at all levels of the nervous system, and that includes the spinal cord as well, the whole neuroaxis. Indeed, the pathological picture of acute morphine intoxication or poisoning is the triad of pinpoint pupils, unconsciousness, and respiratory depression. When one sees these three things, you'd better start looking for needle holes around the arms or the legs, the very first thing. And when death does come, death is through respiratory depression. The patient stops breathing before the heart stops beating. This then is not a safe drug that we are talking about, nor is this a very safe class of drugs. This has real significance to the person who has been addicted, particularly on heroin, which, as we said, is more potent than morphine is, by about 3 times. This person takes the, quote, cure, unquote, cure, and is away from it for several weeks, and then comes back and takes a shot of his original dose, he is quite liable to be a dead person. Or if during the course of his addiction he has been taking diluted drugs and all of a sudden gets an undiluted bag, in their terminology, he could be a dead person. These are the great unknowns that he has to deal with. The relief of pain, of course, is the primary reason for using it. In the pharmaceutical armamentarium, Sir William Osler referred to morphine as God's own drug. Back in 1680, Sydenham wrote to the effect that of all of the medications that the good Lord saw fit to give us, that opium was the most important of them all. But like all good things God gives us, we tend to abuse them, and this is certainly a group of drugs which has come to be abused badly, probably not quite so badly as we would be led to believe by popular articles, but nevertheless it is a public health problem, and a public health problem which has to be discussed, which has to be understood, and which a seminar like this is trying to do this very same thing. What is addiction? As I reviewed the literature rather completely in the last few weeks, I found many, many definitions of addiction, which of course express the personality of the individual writing, the clinical experience of the person writing that definition, his own biases and slants toward the problem, and probably the most complete, the most amalgamated definition that I could find, and I think the most, in my own mind, acceptable definition, is that of the expert committee of the World Health Organization. They say drug addiction is a state of periodic or chronic intoxication detrimental to the individual and to society, I'm pausing for two reasons. One, to give you a chance to write it down, and secondly, to break this down into its significant components, because there's scarcely a word that's wasted in this definition. And it's one of those jokers you can start from either end and you can find enough to talk on just in one paragraph for a couple days. All right, it's detrimental to the individual and society, produced by the repeated consumption of a drug natural or synthetic, its characteristics include 1, an overpowering need or compulsion to continue taking the drug, an overpowering need or compulsion to continue taking the drug. And to obtain it by any means. Two, a tendency to increase the dose. And 3, a psychic or psychological and sometimes a physical dependence on the effects of the drug. A psychic, a psychological, and sometimes a physical dependence on the effects of the drug. Now it takes 3 things to make an addict. It takes the available drug, it takes a psychologically maladjusted individual, and it takes a mechanism for bringing them together. Now if we want to be real scientific about these 3 things, we can say we're talking about the drug, the patient, and the environment. And if we want to use fancy words, we can talk about the pharmacological, the psychological, and the socio-cultural factors in addiction. But basically the problem lies with the drug, the person who uses that drug, and how they come together. John B., in his chapter in Goodman and Gilman, which of course is the Bible of pharmacology, the pharmacological basis of medical practice, has this definition of addiction, which goes a little bit further in one aspect. He says it's a behavioral pattern of compulsive drug use characterized by overwhelming involvement with the use of the drug, the securing of its supply, and a high tendency to relapse after withdrawal. Now we learn a little something else about here because of the high tendency to relapse after withdrawal. I want to give you one other definition which is quite fascinating, and it may be why the British, in spite of their free distribution system, not free but legal distribution system of narcotics, report only 500 cases of narcotic addiction in Great Britain, which is very hard for me to understand. I just got the new nomenclature of the American Psychiatric Association, and it may be in their definition that when you don't need more in terms of dependency needs and tolerance needs, then you're not considered an addict in Great Britain, but I'd be willing to bet there's more than 500. But anyhow, they define addiction simply, an addict, as a person who feels normal on drugs. Now this is quite an interesting statement, and it has implicit several things, because one of the things that happens with this group of drugs is you develop tolerance. The average therapeutic dosage of morphine sulfate, for instance, by either route is 10 to 15 milligrams, probably 4 times a day. Tolerance to this drug, that is achieving the same effects with the same medicine, oftentimes requires increasing the dosage when a person begins to develop tolerance to this drug, and cases have been reported where a tolerance of up to 500 milligrams a day has been developed within a week or 10 days' time. And this is a tremendous adjustment that the body makes to a toxic drug. What this means, in the British definition, if a person needs this much in order to feel normal because he has developed tolerance, he's developed a very expensive habit. The other factor in the definition that I think we should discuss is the business of dependence. This is the development of a physical dependence upon the drug itself. More recent work indicates that one probably does not have to take the narcotics over a long period of time to develop a dependence, a physical dependence on that drug. And dependence we can consider from 2 aspects: the physical and the psychological dependence. Now, many of the authors just don't quite agree on the relative interrelationships of the 2 types of dependence, and I don't think we should go into that too much now. For instance, some of the writers with very sick schizophrenic people who were so far removed from contact with reality, with animals and so forth, with self-feeding mechanisms, have felt that a physical dependence can develop without a psychological dependence. In particular, with these schizophrenic patients, they were given high doses of the drug. They showed none of the typical psychological dependence. It made them feel good. It was the euphoria business. And I do want to, before we go on here, leave this with the changes in mood and thought. The physical dependence is manifested when the drug is taken away from the individual. The individual goes through a rather typical withdrawal syndrome or group of symptoms for that particular drug. It is a fearsome thing for the patient to go through, For the uninitiated professional person, no matter how sophisticated he thinks he might be, it's a rather fearsome thing for him to see for the first 1 or 2 times, because the patient shows the reverse type of symptoms that were produced by the drug. Let me give you just a few illustrations without going through the whole withdrawal symptom. You've heard the term kicking the habit. You've heard the term cold turkey. Some of the effects, physiological effects and the pharmacological effects on morphine, in addition to the central nervous system depressant, it constricts the pupils, it constricts the intestinal motility, or depresses it. It has a specific action on the sweating of the body in addition to the respiration, and there's scarcely a function of the body that is not involved by morphine. Now, when one takes morphine away, one begins within 8 hours of the last dose. Person begins to cry, to lacrimate, his nose begins running, and he begins yawning. He becomes restless, somewhat confused, somewhat excited, and it's quite possible as this develops over the next day or so to find the individual over in the corner on a very hot day in a very hot room covered with a blanket because he's having chills. Quite uncomfortable. He's having, again because of the decreased intestinal motility caused by the drug initially, these things are reversed, that people postulate there's a hyper-excitability or over-excitability of the organ systems of the body. When the drug is taken away, they overreact. So he's having tremendous abdominal cramps. He aches in the bones and the muscles. These are what Wickler, who spent many years working down at Lexington Narcotics Hospital, describes as the non-purposive syndromes. The purposive syndromes are the wheedling syndromes. Now, these guys are con artists. They'll come into the doctor's office with all kinds of complaints, and they'll go peddling around. They use this right from the beginning. They'll con you on the ward of a narcotic hospital. If they think they can get away with it, they'll tell you all kinds of reasons why they should have a shot, and man, you're a nasty man if you don't give me a shot. I'm suffering so much. And they'll do it with all sincerity, with all truth in their own minds, but you simply cannot do it. So suffice it to say that there is a tremendous overreaction of the whole body when this drug is taken away, because remember, this is a depressant drug. The kicking the habit of idea comes from the fact that there's a lot of involuntary muscle spasms in this withdrawal thing, and actually there's a lot of actual kicking movements of the legs and the extremities. The cold turkey business comes from because the pilomotor activity of the skin, I'll never forget the first lecture I had in medical school was on the functions of the skin, and the professor said, well, the first function of the skin is it keeps the outside out and the inside in. And he went on from there to some 14 other functions of the skin, and all of the hairs have a little muscle attached to it, the pilomotor muscle, which causes it to stand up sometimes when you're cold or when you get goose flesh. This is what causes that. Well, in the narcotics addict, in the withdrawal phase, he has this goose flesh, and it looks like a plucked turkey, and that's why they call it cold turkey. This is when you absolutely chop off the medication, and he has to sweat it out, and it gets rough. Now, things have become a little bit more sane in the treatment of the addict, because now simply what they do is they take advantage of this particular phenomena of dependence, and in certain of the drugs, although they are not chemically related to this phenanthine ring of the demerol with its substituted side chains, but they take, for instance, the drug methadone, which in general is a drug that takes longer to act. Its survival rate in the body is a longer period of time, and generally it's a slower acting type of drug. Because even though its chemical formula is quite dissimilar, its broad spectrum of pharmacological action is similar enough that it can be substituted for the heroin, or in rare occasions the morphine, and the patient then is placed on methadone, and then over the next 5 to 6 or 10 days the dosage is reduced gradually, and then it is withdrawn completely. This is far more humane, tolerable, and it is not impossible for somebody to have a cardiovascular collapse and die in the cold turkey treatment of withdrawal of narcotic drugs. So it is not a completely safe, nor is it a pleasant type of relationship. Now time is running out on us. I do want to go on. We'll have a little time, I think, for some questions on this business of dependence, and then because this is what it's all about. The question is oftentimes raised, why do some people become addicted, and why do other people not become addicted when they are exposed to the narcotic drugs? I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't think anybody that will speak to you in this 2-week period of time really knows the answer to that, because if we did, we wouldn't have to have this type of seminar. Actually, the records seem to indicate that the majority of normal, pain-free individuals who are exposed or given opiates find it quite unpleasant. The specific effects on the vomiting center are such that it creates nausea and vomiting. And if one talks to enough addicts, one finds that there is a learning process in there, that they have to learn to get over this unpleasantness of nausea and vomiting, and sort of look through this smoke screen of these unpleasant effects to find the desired euphoric effects. So there is some learning involved in becoming an addict. What people then become addicts? I read Freud, I read Sandor Rado's theories on this. I'm more inclined to agree with Redlich and Friedman in their new textbook on psychiatry when they state it is questionable then whether one can speak meaningfully of an addictive personality beyond the tautological statement that such a person, for one reason or another, has the compulsion to take drugs. At present, we are inclined to believe that addicts are a heterogeneous lot. Now, this does away with all of the statements of orality, of dependence, and so forth. I think there are some interesting observations that possibly can be made, and I think one simply cannot say that the addictive personality as ascribed to the alcoholic applies to the narcotic. I do not believe they are one and the same thing. Yes, they are both addictions to a drug. Alcohol is indeed a drug. What's the difference? It would seem that the common denominator, at least in the narcotic individual or the addict, is that he has difficulty in controlling the very basic drives of life, whether they are to satisfy the needs of hunger, aggression, or sex. Morphine, in its action as a class of drugs, and heroin certainly, takes away from him any challenge, any threat which may be involved in the expression of any of these drives. Because the mechanism of narcotic usage is one of withdrawal. You will recall the definition that we used originally of the World Health Organization, that this implied harm to himself and to others. And basically the harm is more to the individual than it is to others in the narcotic addict, because it is a self-perpetuating cycle. The more drug he uses in his search for peace and freedom from anxiety and tension, which he has a low tolerance for, the more he uses it, the more withdrawn he becomes in the social framework of his life. The more, as Wickle says, his life becomes a compulsive search for the drug, and sometimes the search for the drug is the most important part of the game in itself. And then, of course, this is reinforced when he achieves obtaining the drug and takes the drug, satisfies his craving for the drug, and then he can say, that's a job well done, now I feel normal again. No patient, medical, surgical, psychiatric, exists in a vacuum. There are enough studies to show that some wives of a narcotic addict, or families, a mother usually, can't stand prosperity because they can't stand the disordered equilibrium in the household now that John has come back from Lexington and he's been withdrawn from narcotics, and they're the first ones to get him back on it again one way or another. One often sees this with an alcoholic. I've known a couple cases where they no sooner came home from the hospital after going through a quote cure for alcoholism, and the wife's got cold beer in the refrigerator for him. So everybody is interacting in one way or another with each other. We cannot moralize on this problem. We're way past this point. The laws are at variance with each other in different ways. The legal attitude towards the narcotic addict is, of course, that it is not a crime to be an addict in itself. It is a crime to possess narcotics and the paraphernalia associated therewith. But for all intents and purposes, the legal attitude toward the narcotic addict is that he is a criminal. Now, one might be tempted to say that this is one heck of a way to run a business, that this is a patient and not a criminal. But when one reviews the discharge rates of cures, so-called, from the Lexington Public Health Hospital, the Riverside Hospital in New York, which is for adolescents, young adolescents, one finds that we are now talking from 10%, only 10% of people remain off the drugs, to maybe 25%. So we're talking about a 75% at best failure rate. Why? One, we are asking a person to give up something that he really doesn't want to give up because it makes him feel so good. And if we all had a good supply of don't give a damn pills that we could take all the time, then we probably wouldn't want to give them up very easily, and have, particularly if to begin with we are a basically inadequate personality who cannot stand the slightest strains and stresses of everyday life. It's the easy way out. Well, I'll come back briefly to my reference to the law, because this is one time when it seems as though it might be a good thing to consider even a more widespread inclusion of the addict within the law, because it seems, and this may be related to the typical family structure that the addict seems to come from, where the father, if he is physically present in the home, is sort of a vague, remote, evanescent sort of a creature who may flit in and may flit out, but never has a very significant role to play in the individual narcotic addict's life. The mother, on the other hand, is domineering, punitive at times, but not really concerned with the individual. Not really expecting any patterns of behavior or productivity from the individual. Socioculturally, the picture of the addict has changed, so now that men predominate 4-to-1 over women, the age rate has gone down from probably in the 30s. It has gone down considerably now, so the average addict that comes to the attention of the narcotic hospital at Lexington is probably around 22 years old. He's been exposed to the drugs since he's been 18. 85% of the, I think it's 85% of these people have not finished high school, because the drug has started so early in their life that it interferes with their whole life and their education. This then becomes an end in itself. This is the education, this is their life, and there's nothing beyond that point. But I think what I'm trying to say, and I don't know what the answer is, if we treat an individual, and one must do this in a closed setting to keep them away, because they'll hide medicine in all conceivable bodily orifices to get out the drugs I'm speaking about, their friends, relatives will smuggle it into them. One must withdraw a patient in a narcotic hospital or in a strictly secured ward of a general hospital. If one returns the individual to exactly the same environment from which he came, where drugs are readily available, where its use is sanctioned by the social culture around him, and believe it or not, many of these people are not criminals in the sense that crimes are committed against other people. There's crimes against property, yes, but not crimes against persons, because the basic function of morphine is to take away aggressive drives. And so this is sort of little loose thinking to say that these are killers and whatnot, because they're not. They may take some other drugs, but the people who are taking these type of narcotics are depressed. They are not depressed in the aggressive sexual standpoints. The courts may well help. There are suggestions from the figures that where there is a stern follow-up approach, either through the court, for instance at the narcotics hospital, there's only 1/3 of those people who came in on a voluntary admission stay there suggested 4 months. Only 1/2 stay 1 month. But those people who stay 4 months seem to do better than those who go out within 2 weeks after their withdrawal symptom is over and they can walk and have the strength to stand up. Those who go back to some of the pilot projects like the New York project, and several of the outpatient clinics that they have tried to set up in New York, gone back to the supervision of parole officers, seem to do a little better when there's an authoritarian figure in their life. Now, they may rebel against it at first, but generally they may respond a little better. So you see, we have been talking, and I'm talking too long, about a drug which in itself has the capacity of making everything look rosy as all get out, which at the same time, as your body adjusts to its effects, you need more and more of it to get the initial effect. And then as you begin to take more and more of it, you build a physiological dependence upon the drug, and then you begin to need the drug to keep normal. It's a drug which has been around as long as mankind has known that there were plants and that they could be used. It's a very effective medicine to relieve pain. It's an excellent medication and should be used, but under very strict and controlled circumstances. When these controls are lost, when it is used and abused, then we have the problem of drug addiction. I don't think anybody really can tell you what the incidence of drug addiction is now in the United States. The ranges vary anywhere from 60 to 180,000. Somebody else says 48,000. And the more you read, the more figures you find on it. Nevertheless, it is a problem which faces us, and if only one person is addicted to drug of this type, then it is a reason for us to be concerned. Many of these other things I think you'll find quite fascinating when you find more of the details from your other sessions on the more details on the personality aspects of the addict, the socio-cultural aspects. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you some about the medical aspects of this problem today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. I wonder if you would be willing to answer a few questions from the audience at this time.
Sir?
What is the pattern that keeps it from being highly addictive?
The pattern, and I think I'd have to leave this to the Dr. Kaufman or Mr. Berner, our pharmacist, is in the benzoquinoline group of alkaloids. It's in a different type of alkaloid series, and it has an entirely different pharmacological effect. Am I right on that? Yes, ma'am.
Do most narcotics addicts resemble schizophrenia rather than any other type of psychotic disease?
No. Wickles studied this. Robert Felix actually studied a group of patients. Now remember, this is an artificially selected group of patients who, quote, come voluntarily to Lexington Public Health Service Hospital. And he thought that if there was anything tendency towards a psychotic reaction, there were probably 50% of them were schizophrenic. But I think most authors now will quite agree that there's no predominance of any one particular neurotic reaction or psychotic reaction. Classification-wise, the tendency to addiction and addiction itself is included in the personality disorders as an inadequate personality. This is not to say that a schizophrenic cannot become a drug addict or a neurotic cannot become a drug addict, because they do. But to say that this is, somehow we seem to be compelled to find out what kind of a person is going to do this. They haven't been able to do it so far. There's no indication that there's any relationship with any type of the major mental illnesses, and certainly not the schizophrenic illness.
You mentioned now that they're using methadone in withdrawing these patients. Is there not figures that substantiate that a greater percentage of former addicts will go back to drug addiction once they've been withdrawn on methadone because it is not as painful?
It is not as painful?
Well, physically and psychologically.
Well, methadone is probably equianalgesic with morphine. It probably has almost the same amount of ability to produce euphoria, but it works over a longer period of time. It can be taken orally, for instance, in the admission area. It's given by mouth and liquid. It's not injected, and so they refer to this as the cocktail lounge. In contrast, in the withdrawal days, it used to be the shooting gallery where everything was given by needles. I don't know how to answer your question. I don't think it has anything to do with painful or not.
Well, my question was that withdrawal period was not as painful physically and psychologically, not the administration of the drug.
Well, let me answer it this way then. If somebody is going to take a drug deliberately, they're not going to take morphine and they're not going to take methadone particularly, because the narcotic, the sedative effect, is more pronounced than it is with the heroin. One gets his kicks from the heroin. In fact, so much you can get so much reaction that it's a different type of high that one gets with morphine or with methadone. Now, just because it's easier, or if one has learned that this is relatively a more less uncomfortable way of being withdrawn, so if I get hooked again, so what, I can always go down to Lexington. I don't really think so, because this is not what he's looking for. He's looking for the high, which is sort of characteristic of the heroin that one does not get with methadone or with morphine. And it's a completely different experience. As a matter of fact, given the drug intravenously to a narcotic addict in the post-addict stage, he can tell you what drug he's getting if you give it to him blind. Now, subcutaneously, he can't. But if you mainline it with him, he can tell you whether he's getting the heroin or whether he's getting morphine. So their actions are that specific that an addict will tell you. And I think this probably answers that question for you, I hope.
Dr. Murray, you mentioned that if a person goes off the drug and then comes back a week later or such and they're given a shot, they may die. Is this an allergic response, or do they know exactly what causes this?
No, it's not an allergic response. What happens is that the body builds up a tolerance to this drug. Let's say we go for a couple days. Now, an irregular administration of medication in itself will not make a person either tolerant or dependent. And these are the two essentials of the addiction process. If we give it to somebody, say, 4 times a day regularly for 2 weeks, the chances are at the end of those 2 weeks, he's going to be not only dependent, but he's going to probably start to need the 5th dose during the day, or maybe an increased dosage 4 times a day to get that same effect. Now, if this goes on over months and over years, and now instead of a 40 milligram a day habit, he's got a 500 gram habit, and then he is withdrawn over a period, and if somebody cold turkeys it 10 days to 2 weeks, he's over the withdrawal. And if he goes back to his community, like 1/3 of the patients, voluntary patients from Lexington do, just as soon as they can walk after this initial withdrawal phase, and goes back and he recalls that the last shot that he had before he was withdrawn was, say, 500 milligrams, the chances are quite good if he gets 500 milligrams and shoots that into a vein, he may be dead, because he has lost the physiological adjustment that the cells have and the tissues have made. Pharmacologically, it's a moot point now how this comes about. Is it a metabolic effect or detoxification effect in the body, or is it at the cellular level? And it may be both, but the thinking right now is that it is at the cellular level, that under the depressive effect of the drug, in order to keep that patient, wherever these cells may be, whether they're skin cells, brain cells, liver cells, kidney cells, this is even expressed in tissue cultures, where a tissue culture of cells which has been bathed in a narcotic solution, once this is withdrawn, does not grow as rapidly. Now, what happens is this. Under the continued influence of the drug, the cells function in an overactive stage, hyperexcitability. And this very well may be then, here are cells in a hyperexcitable state requiring increased amounts of the drug to suppress it, that when this hyperexcitability wears off, and then one comes along then with the same dose that's here, and now the hyperexcitability is down to here, that boom, then you're in trouble. And this would seem to be the mechanism.
A couple of years ago, I read an article about a clinic in New York who was using a drug, and I believe it was methadone, as a basis for outpatient treatment. The patient came in and got the drug, say, in the morning, and then was able to function in a normal capacity throughout the day, and this was a routine occurrence. Is this being done, or is it being advocated or carried out any longer?
This is a very confused area in this field. A Supreme Court ruling back in the early 1920s ruled that it was improper practice of medicine to give a narcotic to an individual patient just to relieve his sufferings or to keep him functioning as normal. Now, this is another reason. If this is what they're doing in Great Britain, this is why they're not reporting more than 500 cases, because they're keeping them normal by definition, and if they're just keeping them, quote, normal, unquote, by giving them what they need of the narcotic each day. This cannot be done in the United States. So subsequently, there was a whole field of outpatient clinics that were available, but they were closed down under the effects of the Supreme Court ruling by the American Medical Association pressures in about 1924. Now, more recently, Marie Niswander has been working in this field of providing methadone. She has been attacked quite seriously by some of her colleagues in this area, whether this was legally and morally proper to do it, because indeed the law now provides that a physician may supply a narcotic to an individual in larger doses only if they are in the terminal phases of a physical illness. He may not continue to supply a given level of a narcotic drug to a patient to keep him, quote, normal, unquote. This is considered to be aiding and abetting a narcotic. I don't know what the phraseology is, but this is my own. He's aiding and abetting. And he can get in real serious trouble for this. Now, it is generally accepted in writing, I think, by the National Research Council, their Committee on Narcotic Addiction, that it is quite proper for a physician to provide a patient with narcotics for a period of 10 to 14 days without increasing the level during the interim period while he is providing for hospitalization for this person. Some attempts are being made to withdraw people from narcotics on an outpatient basis. I'm sort of like the man from Missouri. I'd like to see this be done. I'll never forget, I don't know if you ever heard of the Baron Munchausen syndrome in general medicine. When I was in training in Connecticut, I had some fellow come to the hospital, and I figured he had been, and I made up on index cards all of the hospitals that he had been in, and at that time it was 67 hospitals. Now, this is a guy that pedals around from one emergency room to another, and I pretty much guarantee you that in most hospitals, if you say, oh, I can't stand it, you know, you keep this up, get some tears in your eyes, you'll get a shot of morphine. Well, damn it all. The doctor's in a rough spot when it comes to that. And you can go around and you can pedal around from one doctor to another, you can get most anything you need. And the doctors in all good faith, I think that are the only ones that are taking care of you, when in reality, this guy may be peddling, or this gal may be peddling around to 6 or 8 or a dozen doctors and getting all the different kinds of medications to wake you up in the morning to put you to sleep at night. You can get anything you want, you know, when you get really clever at it. And these guys are clever. And Wickler, in his describing the purposive and the non-purposive, well, the name says, there's a purpose, there's a reason for stating such things. And the reason is, what drugs are designed to gain sympathy or to express uncomfortableness or express the need for the drug. Their purpose is to get more. The non-purposive, of course, are those physiological changes which are going to take place regardless of what you say and do, over which you have no control over. I have my doubts about what's going to happen with the outpatient care of the narcotic addict. I did read a paper that was given in Chicago in 1966. I don't have it with me. It's in my briefcase in my office, where one particular individual criticized Dr. Niswander because they were apparently going ahead and giving higher and higher and higher doses. This is just one paper. I don't know anything more about it, and it would be unfair for me to make any sort of a judgment just on reading one person's critical attack of her practices. She is one of the most learned people in the field of addiction in this country, and knows precisely what she's doing. And if she's doing it, she must have a real good reason for doing it, but what it is, it eludes my grasp right now.
Well, I'm sorry we're out of time, Dr. Murray, but on behalf of the class, I would like to thank you for your excellent presentation and willingness to answer the questions, and could we show our appreciation to Dr. Murray for his